The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
I'd like to welcome everyone to today's food safety webinar, Soil Amendments. In this webinar, we will discuss ways to identify potential routes of food contamination associated with soil amendments. We'll explain soil amendment practices and soil amendment strategies to reduce food safety risks, discuss corrective actions if soil amendment creates a risk, and identify proper record keeping for monitoring and managing soil amendments. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Attendees will learn about produce safety, foodborne pathogens, worker health, wildlife, land use, post-harvest handling, and legal issues associated with food safety in Indian country. The IFAI has also launched a series of in-person food safety trainings in regional locations. I encourage you to visit our website at indigenous.foodandag.com/foodsafety for a listing of these trainings and information about how to register. The in-person training events will result in the award of a certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help you better understand these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the regional training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We're merely trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the regional training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll find the slideshow being presented today. I invite you to visit our website at indigenous.foodandag.com/foodsafety, where you will find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. The issues we will cover in business practices, microbiology, and legal issues are additional information our experts think is important to have access to as a grower. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Dr. H.L. Goodwin, will take questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can submit a question by using the questions feature of the control panel. We will also be conducting a live poll during this presentation. When we reach the live polling slides, I will provide instructions for using your mobile device to participate in the poll, and the poll results will appear in real time on the slide. We encourage everyone to participate in this poll, so please keep your mobile device handy. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of a broad effort we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. H.L. Goodwin, the Senior Economist and Food Safety Director at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. Dr. Goodwin is a professor and poultry economist at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, a senior economist and food safety director at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, and the director of student networking and curriculum enhancement for Bumpers College. He joined the faculty of the University of Arkansas's Center of Excellence for Poultry Science in Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness in December of 1997. Prior to joining the university, he was the Agricultural and Food Systems Policy Advisor to the Minister of Agriculture in Slovakia and a Fulbright Scholar in Czechoslovakia. He was faculty at Texas A&M's Department of Agricultural Economics and served as the Associate Director of the Texas Agriculture Market Research Center. He received his PhD in agricultural economics from Oklahoma State University in 1982. HL, the presentation is yours.
Thank you very much, Brian. I appreciate that lead in to our seminar or webinar. And so what I'm going to do is spend some time on one of the three primary elements of, obviously, of any agricultural production, and that is the soil medium that the crop is grown in. And subsequent webinars, the next two, will deal with the water which the plants use, and the water which is used to process and clean the produce after the harvest. So there are the three components that we'll be working on in the next three webinars. So this module is about soil amendments, and we have some learning objectives. We're going to learn about relative contamination. We're going to explain soil amendment handling and how to reduce risk in that. We're going to look at some strategies such as composting or application intervals to reduce risk. We're going to look at corrective actions that can be utilized if there is a risk presented. I mean, we can never do anything perfectly all the time, so we need to have a plan in place for corrective actions. And we're going to look at some record-keeping tools that will be used for monitoring and managing soil amendment handling to keep us in line with the requirements of FSMA. One of the things that I really want us to pay attention to in this is to highlight the risk of different kinds of soil amendments, including non-manure based and chemical amendments, biosolids, and pre-consumer vegetative waste. So we'll be going through that as we proceed. We're going to look at general ag practices to reduce risk associated with soil amendments. We're going to look in depth on the composting process and ways to reduce cross-contamination in storage areas and on tools. A lot of times we don't think about that. So we're going to point that out. We're going to talk a little bit about worker training and then monitoring, record keeping, and corrective actions. So what is a soil amendment? I'm going to use a definition to just say basically it's anything that amends the character of the soil, either chemical, biological, or physical. And so if you amend the soil in any way to support and improve plant growth, it's a soil amendment. A lot of times soil amendments are put on there to handle soil erosion and runoff. That may reduce those. There are a lot of different kinds of soil amendments available, and we're going to talk about those and talk about the risk that each of those present. So before we get into that in great detail, I just want to review just a moment some of the principles of the microbiology that we're dealing with when we talk about this entire FSMA set of regulations. And one of the things that we're looking at is biological pathogens. That's the predominant vector of human health issues, is pathogens. And so that includes things like Salmonella, E. coli, and then after processing, we have Listeria. We also have Clostridiums, excuse me, and Cryptosporidium and other things. So that's what we're going to be looking at. But just to remind you that these safety risks are posed in any growing situation. So, you know, it makes sense that particularly untreated or raw soil amendments would be the most likely to pose a significant food safety risk, particularly if it's manure or if it's any other animal product. Plants in and of themselves do not support these biological pathogens. So it's important to remember that we're controlling these things that are derived from animal vectors. If we use, you might say to yourself, well, I use commercial fertilizer, I don't have to worry about it. We will go over some things that point out that there are risks with chemical soil amendments, particularly based on application and preparation. So anytime we're going to look at the risks, we need to pay particular attention to applying them to the produce on the field. So let's assess our risk. And remember, we're talking specifically, or I mentioned specifically, about products of animal origin. I'll get into that in some detail when we get to the composting sector. So I wanted to point that out. I'll be coming back to what we just covered, but doing it in much more detail. So the first thing to do is ask yourself the question, what type of soil amendment do I use in my production operation? Is it raw manure? Is it composted manure? Is it chemical? Is it composted plant material? What is it? What crops receive the soil amendments? Are they fresh produce or are they agronomic crops? The thing we want to be considerate of here is, are they covered crops, covered produce? In other words, foods that are produced that are not likely to be eaten raw. For example, dried beans, other things that are not likely to be eaten raw. Sweet potatoes are on the list. So there are all sorts of products that are not covered. And so we want to think about, is it fresh produce that is covered or is it not covered? When do we apply these soil amendments? How close is it to harvest? What time of year is it? All these things are important considerations. Do we apply them and incorporate them into the soil? Are they injected beneath the surface in the case of liquid products, or are they surface applied? And that makes a great deal of difference with the contact of the plant. And how much and how often do we apply these things? We can have all sorts of negative environmental impacts, in addition to actually wasting the value, the nutritive value of our soil amendments if they're not applied appropriately. Applying them during the wrong time of the year, applying them at a rate that exceeds recommendations for nutrients is really an inefficient way to deal with these soil amendments. So let's look at the easiest one first, and that's chemical. You got a minimal risk of human pathogens in this one, simply because they're synthetic fertilizers or minerals. Now, we can't say they're 100% safe because there could be issues in handling. There could be things like dead vermin that might be in bulk fertilizer as you pour it into your spreading device and so forth. But primarily we look at the chemical risk to humans, and we have to make certain that we train the workers appropriately to handle these fertilizers. These food safety risks, if applied improperly, can include particularly health hazard risks to the worker or the person handling the chemicals. So you want to make sure everybody's trained appropriately to apply them and to use personal protective equipment, dust masks, gloves, other things as necessary. Follow the application instructions specifically, and make sure there's proper labeling and storage of these chemical soil amendments on your farm. The next one we'll go to is human waste and biosolids. Note that first bullet. Human waste is prohibited for use on produce crops unless it meets EPA regulation for biosolids. And let me tell you, that is very, very stringent. It has to be an EPA approved method. And there are a few things that meet this, but most of them, in fact, are not economically feasible to use to begin with. I believe there's one treatment that's actually human waste that's been approved called Milorganite. It's from Milwaukee, from their sewage system. And so that's one specifically that you may or may not know about. And the reason for this is because, you know, human waste has pathogens. It might have heavy metals. It could have other contaminants, medications that are in your system. So all kinds of things that could get in the food chain that we don't want there. It's questionable whether any produce grown with human waste or biosolids would be acceptable to produce buyers. And so therefore we're not going to discuss how to manage this. That is an entire very large body of work, and we're not going to get into that because we're assuming that nobody is using that for this instance. Now, if you're using it on agronomic crops, you've got a different question, but produce and dairy are strictly prohibited and have very stringent health guidelines. Pre-consumer vegetative waste. This is, you know, produce food preparation waste, out-of-date vegetables, food products removed from their packages. If you have out-of-date or damaged, a damaged run of frozen vegetables or something else that go through a processing plant, this is a pre-consumer vegetative waste. And we can't consider this to be zero risk either because it might contain chemical, physical, or biological hazards. These are the three hazards that we're looking at all the way through the food chain. And so we need to be careful. There could be pesticides, glass, all kinds of things, table waste, obviously could be contaminated either by domestic animals or by people. A lot of times there are vermin that live or grow in these areas that have pre-consumer vegetative waste, such that they're going to be contaminated with pathogens from biological source. So this is something that we don't really want to consider zero risk, particularly if you include yard waste, lawn clippings, leaves, etc., which are probably containing feces of animals of all types. So you can't really use this without some kind of processing, composting, or some other treatment. And then there's another class, non-manure-based soil amendments of animal origin. And you see a list of them there. They usually come from slaughter plants or rendering plants. And the key there is these things have to be processed to eliminate the pathogens. If you don't, you have to consider them untreated biological amendments of animal origin. And this means that it would have to be further processed in some way, like composting. However, if you think about the composting process and composting these kinds of animal materials, the likelihood of undesirable vermin, rats, skunks, etc., getting in the composting area would be fairly high. So that brings a whole other problem. So usually anything that we would get of animal origin would already be processed. And many of you may be familiar if you work with flowers or other ornamentals, the use of blood meal and fish emulsion and so forth on certain landscape plants. So now let's talk about manure. Manure has a lot of good qualities. It increases the friability or makes the tilth of the soil, the texture of it, much more friendly. It increases fertility, of course. And importantly, particularly in many areas that do not have access to irrigation, the water holding capacity of the soil is increased because it's high in the high content of organic matter and the carbon. Many soils are carbon poor, particularly in areas that have a lot of sandy soils, or in areas that are in the more humid or high rainfall areas where carbon is broken down quickly. So if you're going to look at the true value of manure, you have to think about the nutrient management systems and the waste utilization for people either with animals or partnering with other farms who have animals. In this area of Arkansas where we're located, poultry manure is a very, very high value and widely used and very cost effective source of manure. And it's used frequently on agronomic crops and on pastures, but to be used meaningfully on produce, it must be composted. Well, why is that? Because manures can carry human pathogens. Animals are reservoirs for certain pathogens. Just about any animal has pathogens. For example, poultry has a high incidence of Campylobacter and Salmonella naturally occurring in their gut. E. coli is predominant in bovine, dairy, beef, and then also in swine. So that's just something that happens. And as waste material passes through the digestive tract, you've got shedding of these pathogens in the manure. And there are all kinds of things that affect that. You can see them there on the board. But just remember, human pathogens come from animals, and different animals are reservoirs for these kinds of things. And this includes wild animals and wildlife. So now we're going to start dissecting this stuff in here. Untreated soil amendments. The first bullet, if you have biological soil amendments of animal origin, they're very high risk because they have not been treated to reduce or eliminate pathogens. And so here's a list of what would be considered untreated. Raw manure, aged or stacked manure. I mean, how many of us that grew up on a farm had stacks of manure around, whether it's horse manure or dairy manure from, when we mucked out the stalls of our dairy cattle or of our horses. Untreated manure slurries, if you're familiar with dairy production or hog production, you get in a situation there. Untreated manure teas. I always thought this was a strange choice of words, manure tea, but it really, the water percolates through the stack of the manure and leaches nutrients and pathogens out, and it runs off in the water. So any kind of soil amendment that includes raw manure is untreated. So we have to be aware of these things and cognizant of some type of method, excuse me, that will allow us to deal with that. So how do we reduce soil amendments? One of the things we can do is implement good ag practices on the farm. For example, some for soil amendment would be selecting your soil amendments which have been treated instead of using raw, extending the application to harvest interval. So, you may decide to stop application of soil amendment 60 days prior to harvest, or 30 days. It's the longer, the better. assuring that application methods don't put adjacent crops at risk, like wind drift on a dry day or runoff in a wet period. Proper storage to reduce runoff risk to produce fields is another key thing. So placement, if you're doing your own soil amendment gathering and processing, composting, you have to be aware of location of the site where you're gathering that to your production area. Here's one that I never think about, or had never thought about until FSMA came along. Handling practices to reduce runoff risk in the produce fields. And also to reduce cross-contamination from soil amendments to equipment and tools. You see in the picture there a manure spreader and the tractor. How many people would think about a wash down of that tractor before they used another implement on there? Record keeping, to make sure we monitor when we put amendments on, how much, what the source was, etc. So keeping monitoring of that application and the treatment of the soil amendment is very, very important. So now we're going to get to composting. Composting, there are very, very specific guidelines on how composting is to be handled that are within FSMA. Essentially, what you have to do is use a process to produce stabilized compost, where organic material is decomposed by microorganisms under heat conditions for a certain period of time. For example, 3 days at a temperature of at least 131 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by a curing stage under cooler conditions. And so how you arrive at this composting method, this thermophilic composting, is, you can have it at lower temperatures for longer periods of time. So there are all different prescriptive ways that you can do that. There has to be scientific validation of the composting. So the next slide is going to show us some more detail about that. Let me talk just a little bit about curing, because most people don't think about curing as part of the composting process. But it's actually the final stage, and it's conducted after most of the readily metabolizable material has been decomposed, and it occurs at a cooler temperature. And what that does is it continues to reduce pathogens, and it promotes decomposition of cellulose and lignin, other types of carbon, and it stabilizes it. So depending on the environmental conditions will make a difference on how that's cured. So here's a summary of this. You may want to jot a few notes down. You see the fellow there, he's turning his compost to make sure that adequate oxygen is present. And you have to have carbon nitrogen ratio of a certain level and a certain amount of moisture. And you want this to be aerobic. You can see there for turn composting, regulation suggestion is 15 days with a turning every 3 days. So any scientifically validated composting process is acceptable, but it must be scientifically validated. So we said this was all about risk, right? So let's look at reducing risk during the application. So we've covered how to help control and eliminate the pathogens, but let's look now at reducing risk during application. So one simple thing that you can do is to apply manure during non-produce growing periods. In other words, cover crops, grains, etc., that are in some type of rotation. Pathogens can survive in manure, compost, and soil for long periods of time. So you have to, it's best to maximize the time between application and harvest of the produce. Here's a big key. Keep untreated soil amendments from touching the edible portions of the crop. It's easy to achieve for tree fruits, but it's a lot more difficult for crops grown on or close to the soil. For example, vining tomatoes, snap beans are another issue. Strawberries, obviously. So we have to pay attention to that. Side dressing should only be utilized if properly composted or treated soil amendments are used, and it does not contact the edible portion of the crop. Don't spread in high wind periods. Don't apply when the ground is saturated or frozen, because you're going to increase the risk of runoff. So a lot of that's common sense, but it's things that we need to be reminded of. And these are good agricultural practices that will help ensure that you've reduced the risk of using soil amendments. This is important. There's no minimum application intervals currently involved in the FSMA for raw manure. Okay, it is not in there. Untreated soil amendments, FDA is trying to find out more information about this to deal with this, and there's extensive documentation in the FSMA regulation about untreated soil amendments. But the key thing to remember there is raw manure can't be applied directly to harvestable portion of the crop. Of course, if you don't use untreated soil amendments, you don't have to think about it. I might mention here that coming in the next few days, we will post on our website a soil amendments decision tree. And it will start out with a yes and no question. Do you use inorganic fertilizer? And so there's the whole inorganic part. It talks about leachates and other things. And then there's another section we do about that will include compost and manure products. So this is a decision tree. It has about 16 or 18 questions. Yes, no. If it's yes, you proceed to this step. If it's no, you proceed to a different step. So that will be posted also with documentation by the end of this week or the first part of next week, maybe the first part of next week. Excuse me. So what are some handling recommendations? Have designated equipment and designated tools to handle soil amendments. Have some kind of standard operating procedure to clean and sanitize equipment and tools that contact your soil amendments and your produce. And third, be careful about foot traffic or equipment traffic. I already talked about the tractors. Many times we forget about our boots or the wheels on our wagons or whatever that we may be carrying materials in. One good way to reduce cross-contamination risk is to direct farm traffic away from soil amendment handling and loading areas so that you reduce the chance of tracking contamination from the manure or compost pile to other areas of the farm or packing house. And so if equipment is used for handling soil amendments, it should not serve as a source of cross-contamination of the produce. So be careful with your traffic and your tools and your equipment with which you handle soil amendments. How do you handle your storage areas? There's some things that growers can do to minimize risk. Keep finished compost piles covered and separated from raw manure. So if it's finished, you cover it. Why do you want it covered? Because you don't want vermin tracking through your compost and contaminating it, flights of birds coming in and leaving droppings, etc. You've already been through the composting process. Why would you want to contaminate your treated compost? Keep domestic and animals and wildlife away from compost piles so it won't be cross-contaminated with fecal material. This could be as simple as fencing the compost piles to prevent other animals from contaminating it with the feces. Many people use stacking sheds that are closed to access from random wildlife. You need to store your amendments away from produce growing and handling areas and high traffic areas. So you don't want unintended contamination of equipment, footwear, or packing facilities. This is particularly important, let's say, if you have a pick your own or a public access area. The last thing you want is people walking around through or close to soil amendments. Not only is it probably not good for business, but it's also bad for the spread of pathogens. Worker training. You know, we beat on worker training in every webinar, but you as a grower are responsible for your workers. And if it's like most small operations that I grew up on, the workers were my dad and my mom and myself and my cousin. Those were the workers. None of us were paid, and but we were still, had these rules been in effect then, we would have had to comply with them. So you need to have standard operating procedures for properly completing tasks which require managing raw manure or compost. What does this mean? That means you need to provide resources to the workers so they can do their job properly. Like what? Additional clothing worn during produce handling. Gloves, overalls, aprons should be kept clean, changed when they're dirty, and prior to entering packing and produce and handling areas. You don't want people going from the dirty area into the clean area. You want the action to flow the opposite way. A lot of farm activities are likely to cause clothing to become soiled, obviously, so it's important to pay attention when activities involving raw animal manure that could cross-contaminate food products, the produce, or the contact surfaces. So we have to make sure that the boots, the clothes, and the gloves are clean, and wash your hands. We have to have adequate portable washing facilities. That's as important as the toilet facilities. You must have these washing stations at each of those, and anywhere where you're going to contact produce or contact surfaces of the produce, you must have washing stations for hands. Record keeping is so important. You've got to have logs of soil amendment use and handling to record what's been done and allow the process to be reviewed from year to year. And in the record keeping materials in sections of FSMA, you can just figure 3 years for most records. It has to have the type and source of soil amendment. If it doesn't come from you, if you didn't document and validate your own composting, but you acquired it from someone else, they need to provide documentation of how they treated it and certify that it's been properly composted. So there are some of the soil amendment record keeping that you need to document and pay attention to. And be careful when you're recording dates of application. Make sure you look at a calendar, because you may record one date. If you've skipped up a week on the calendar, you may be saying and documenting that you applied compost during a heavy rain. So, you know, the best thing to do is, as soon as it's applied, write it down. Or even better yet, before you go to apply it, write it down. And that way you don't have to worry about those type of human errors. Here's some things you want to keep in your records for composting. Time, temperature, how many turnings, when did you turn it? You see the guy here with a temperature probe. We were involved several years ago with a composting project that looked at composting low-value hen and poultry litter, or hen and pullet litter, I'm sorry, waste from the highway department, old hay that was unsuitable for feeding, and eggshell waste. And so we were actually involved in this project, and actually went out and watched them do this, water the compost, do the turnings, and monitor it. And so it's very important that you document all those things. If you buy it from someone, there's the kind of information you need. You must get this kind of information. It's a survival thing. I mean, you've got to protect yourself. If you get it from a third party, it needs to be somebody reputable that knows what they're doing and has a good reputation. And you need to get these specific things under documentation there in that first bracket. And also make sure the validation system that they use for their composting is scientifically appropriate, and that it's been monitored, and that all the steps, that they meet all the steps you would meet if you were doing your own composting. Corrective action plan, we've got to have one. Everybody makes mistakes. Things happen that we don't plan on, and so you need to have a corrective action plan. What could it include? Actions to be taken if raw manure or something other untreated soil amendment was applied too close to harvest. What might this include? Retreatment, composting options if soil amendments were cross-contaminated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to have a way to correct actions that cross-contaminated your soil amendment. Doesn't have to be complicated. You just have to document it so that it's clear that growers considered actions to reduce risk if they happen on their farm. It shows you're paying attention and that you're being careful and that you're serious about your food safety situation. So it's those very crucial to have a corrective action plan. And hopefully we'll never have to implement it. But if you do, it's a lot better to have one thought through and ready to stage than to be scrambling in a panic and not know what to do. So what's our summary? There are three primary ways to reduce risk. Okay, apply your raw or untreated amendments to fields not planted with produce, so you never have direct contact with produce. You can treat or process raw soil amendments to reduce or eliminate pathogens through composting, probably thermophilic composting or some other scientifically validated process. And the third one is you can maximize the time between application of the soil amendment and harvest of your produce. You got to be sure to monitor manure and compost storage areas so they don't contaminate packing areas, produce fields, or water sources. It's a big thing to remember. Your water, and we'll cover this in the next two webinars, you must pay attention to your water source when you're locating, transporting, or applying these soil amendments. You got to train your workers to handle soil amendments and to apply soil amendments properly. Focus on sanitation, separation of tools and equipment used to handle amendments, and then appropriate hygienic practices, hand washing, changing of clothes, sterilization of equipment or wash down, etc. And then the final thing, keep records. Detailed, accurate, timely records. And remember, they have to be made available within a 24-hour period if you're ever challenged or looked at for an inspection. So that concludes this webinar with respect to what material I'm going to present. I covered a lot of ground and I covered it fairly quickly. I'm going to give you quite a bit of time to submit questions. And while that is happening, I'm going to ask Brian if he will go through responding or leading us through the poll response questions. We would like to find out a little bit about you. There are 4 simple questions. None of them are personal. They're about the type of people who may have been listening to this webinar and participating in it. So Brian, do you want to take over from here?
Yeah, thank you, HL. The screen that we have up right now just is prompting you for questions, and I just will remind you first, before we head into our polling questions, that if you just have questions about the presentation itself, please use the questions box in your control panel, type it out and submit it to me, and I'll read your question out loud, and HL will answer it to the best of his ability. So we'll go ahead while you're thinking about that, and we'll move into the polling function. So to do this, we're using software that's called Poll Everywhere. Some of you may be familiar with it. And you're going to use your mobile device to respond to the questions. And as your responses come in, the polling information is going to be displayed on the screen in real time. So there's 2 ways that you can participate. There is, you can use the website, the Poll Everywhere website, or you can just text in your response. And I'll go through each one of those options one at a time. Texting is the way that I have used the most, and I find it to be very simple. Just open up the text app on your phone, and the number that you're going to be texting to is displayed here on your screen. It's 37607. And in order to get into the software and to get into this specific poll, you're going to send the message HL Goodwin 156 to the number 37607. And you can do that right now if you want to use the texting feature. When you send that message, after just a few seconds, you'll get an automatic reply from the software to let you know that you have entered the poll. Once you receive that response, then everything that you enter after that will just be your poll responses, and it'll go directly to the poll. The other option is to use the website. If you see the web address that's displayed on the phone on the screen, it's pollev.com/HLGoodwin156. If you open up your browser and type in that web address, it'll take a minute for it to kind of find the poll, but then the polling questions will come up. So with that, we're going to go to our first question. And without me prompting, somebody has already responded. All right, there we go. Responses are rolling in. So, which term best describes you is the question. And you see the responses there, A through G. You can use the website or the text function to submit your response. And I'll give everyone a little while here to send in their responses. No extension, people, huh? All right, it looks like everyone has responded. Thank you very much. Looks like we've got equal numbers of growers and government agencies employees. So we'll move to our next question. In what region do you live? And you'll probably notice that these are the BIA regions. Wow, look at that. We are all over the place today. Okay, very good. Then we'll move on to our third question, and we have 4 questions for you today. If you are a grower, what is your primary crop? A is root vegetables, B is small fruits, C is grains, D is tree fruits, E is leafy vegetables, and F is something other than that. No leafy vegetable growers. That's surprising. All right, now we'll move on to our last poll question. If you are a grower, what is your average annual gross sales? Okay. I'll give you just another couple of seconds to respond. HL and I very much appreciate you guys participating in this poll. This is a new feature that we're trying out, and I think it's something that we're probably going to be integrating into future webinars. So we really do appreciate your participation. So we are. Go ahead, HL.
I just want to add that last question about the sales. That is overlays exactly the compliance dates for FSMA. Those are the 3 categories: compliance in January 26, 2018 for more than 250,000, 2019 for 25 to 250,000, and 2020 for less than 25,000. So that's where those groupings came from.
All righty. Okay, so now we'll go into our questions that people have posed for HL. We did have one that came in. HL, I'll go ahead and read you this question.
Okay.
I knew a family that planted a vegetable garden on the res. The carrots, for example, that they grew were humongous and hairy. Turns out they planted over the septic system. What options did they have to make the most of the situation, minimize risk, etc.?
Well, I'm going to assume, since they planted it over the septic system, that they didn't have anywhere else to plant. So that's my first assumption. If you can avoid that kind of an area, don't plant there. Plant somewhere. We're working with a group right now that is looking at instigating some high tunnel hoop houses, and one of their locations is on land that has a sewer pipe going through it. Mind you, it's not a septic field, it's a sewer pipe. And we are advising a setback, considerable setback from that pipe, just in the case that there was, for example, stormwater that would come in and infiltrate the system in great amounts and cause it to overflow, or a break in the pipe or whatever. Those carrots, presumably, if they were not eaten raw, probably wouldn't pose a problem. You would peel them and cook them appropriately at appropriate temperatures, and any pathogens that were there, would be killed. That would require a kill step, and the law provides for a kill step. So, assuming they weren't eating these raw and they were cooked appropriately, the kill step for pathogens would be okay, but who knows what the heavy metal or other metal content or residuals of medications or anything else would be there. So my first advice is don't plant them there. My second advice is, if you don't have anywhere else to plant, make sure they're cooked appropriately to go through the pathogen kill step. Under no circumstances would I want to have these vegetables enter the commerce chain.
Okay, thank you, HL. I'll give our attendees just one more opportunity to submit a question for HL. And while you're thinking about that, I'll just remind you that if you have want any further information about the webinars in this series or about our in-person trainings, you'll see the web address that is on the screen right now, indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety. I very much encourage you to visit our website. In addition to our trainings, we also have a lot of other information available on that website. So please visit that, and you'll see there's a wealth of information there. If you have questions after this webinar, you can also call the number that's on the screen there, and we will certainly do anything that we can to answer your questions or to point you in the right direction. It looks like we have another question that came in, HL. Can compost be used to side dress a crop of sweet corn? What would an alternative organic source of nitrogen be if not?
Assuming that it's used appropriately on side dressing and not flung on the side dressing where it would reach the corn, the sweet corn, yes, it is appropriate. I would still want to do that prior to the corn entering the silk stage, because then you're going to have contamination there where it conceivably could creep down into the corn as it was maturing. But as long as it was separated far enough from when the, I'll just call it the fruiting, or when the corn was beginning to tassel and those silks would come out, yes, it would be appropriate. But it would have to be, again, appropriately applied where you would minimize drift and have the adequate setback, and also be far enough away from harvest time such that you wouldn't be getting drift on the corn silks.
All right, thank you, HL. We did have another question that came in. Our tribe hopes to start a composting program that will supply compost for our tribal garden. What resources do you recommend?
I'm presuming there's recommend for establishing this composting program. NRCS and EPA both have excellent resources to describe how you can actually begin a composting process. In addition, on the web, you can find there's a National Association of Composters, and so they have a lot of very, very good material. There's a lot of resource material out there to help you start this correctly. The key things are site selection. What kind of surface are you going to have this on? And plan through which system you're going to use very thoroughly before you start. But these resources, NRCS, EPA, and the Composting Association, American Composting Association, I have a lot of good resource materials out there that would be beneficial. And many of the state extension services associated with the land grant college in that state have developed composting guides. And so there's a lot of good material, but take your time to get this planned out thoroughly prior to beginning it. And I think you'll have a good experience. Set all your validation standards, who's going to be in charge of monitoring that and recording it, so that the people that you distribute the compost to in your tribe for their gardens or for use in your own tribal garden will be totally, it'll be validated that you did everything totally according to the book and that you have a safe product.
All right. It looks like that's the last question that we have received. HL, did you have any closing comments that you wanted to make?
Well, the only closing comment, I have two. One, I appreciate very much those of you who were on the webinar. If you found this useful, please tell others, and please tune in yourself to the next webinar. I forget the exact date, I believe it's in 2 weeks, on agricultural water. And there are many things that are changing in agricultural water since FSMA was enacted. So it would be a good idea to be on this webinar to find out what we need to know about the use of agricultural water in relation to FSMA.
Thank you for that reminder, HL, and I'll just let people know that that is our next webinar that's scheduled. It is scheduled for October 26th at 2 p.m. Central. And if you go to the website that you see listed on your screen, you'll find a registration link for that website, and we definitely encourage you to register for it. It is a two-part webinar, and so the first part will be on October 26th, and you'll see links for both parts of those webinars and the rest of the webinars that we have scheduled for the remainder of the year. So with that, we will go ahead and close out today's webinar. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you attend our next webinar on October 26th.